Before anyone noticed the cold creeping in under the door, before the waitress poured the first cup of coffee or the jukebox clicked to life, something fragile was already breaking inside a small roadside diner on Christmas Eve, the kind of break that doesn't make noise, the kind that starts with a child's whisper and ends with a grown man realizing his heart isn't as hard as the world thinks it is. The diner sat just off a snow-dusted highway outside Flagstaff, a place travelers stopped when they were too tired to keep driving or too broke to go anywhere else, its neon sign buzzing weakly like it might give up at any moment. And inside, the decorations tried their best without much help. A crooked strand of tinsel drooping above the counter, a plastic tree with half its lights burned out, and a paper Santa taped to the window, peeling at the edges. At a small booth near the glass sat a woman named Rachel Harper, her winter coat still on because the heat never quite reached that corner, her hands racked around a menu she already knew by heart, not because she liked the food, but because she'd memorized the prices. Across from her were her twin daughters, Lily and Nora, 8 years old with matching eyes and an awareness no child should have, their legs swinging slightly beneath the table, their voices soft, their movements careful, as if they were guests in a place they weren't sure they were allowed to stay. Rachel had counted the money in her wallet 3 times before walking in, then once more after sitting down, smoothing the bills flat like that might somehow make them stretch further, doing the math in her head the way she did every day now. Subtracting tax, subtracting tomorrow, subtracting hope. She ordered the cheapest thing she could justify calling a meal and told herself this was enough. That one warm dinner in a place with lights and music counted as a Christmas memory, even if there were no presents waiting anywhere else. Life hadn't fallen apart for Rachel all at once. It had chipped away at her slowly, patiently, starting with the accident that put her husband in a hospital bed, followed by the bills that arrived before the flowers wilted, then the job she lost because grief doesn't clock out on time, and finally the quiet eviction notice that felt more like a suggestion than a warning until it was suddenly too late. Now survival was measured in days, sometimes hours, and tonight was about getting through dinner without letting her daughters see the fear she carried like a second spine. The girls didn't complain when the food arrived, a single plate meant to be shared, steam rising like a promise that didn't quite keep itself, and they ate slowly, breaking pieces in half, glancing up at their mother between bites, not asking for more, not asking for anything, which somehow hurt worse than if they had. Rachel smiled when she was supposed to, nodded when they talked about school, and pretended not to notice how thin the portions looked compared to memories from another life, all while deciding whether it was smarter to eat now or save something for later, because hunger wasn't just about empty stomachs anymore, it was about tomorrow. She didn't notice the door open at first, but she felt the shift immediately, the way air changes before a storm, the way sound pulls back on itself. Heavy boots hit tile. Leather creaked. Chairs paused mid-scrape. Members of the Hells Angels stepped inside without saying a word, their presence filling the room more completely than noise ever could. Patched vests dark against the holiday decorations, faces worn by road and weather and things that didn't make it into stories. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Even the waitress hesitated before forcing a smile and walking over. Rachel's shoulders stiffened instantly, fear sliding in beside exhaustion, her instincts telling her not to turn around, not to draw attention, not to be noticed by men who carried reputations heavier than their jackets. The twins felt it too. Children always do, and Lily glanced past her mother's shoulder, eyes widening slightly before she leaned closer to Rachel, seeking safety without words. Rachel reached out and placed a hand over both girls' hands, grounding them, grounding herself, telling her heart to slow down, telling herself they were just people, just customers, just another table in a diner that didn't belong to anyone. Minutes passed, thick and uncomfortable, the kind of minutes that stretch when you're waiting for something you can't name, and Rachel tried to focus on the food, on the warmth, on anything other than the man behind her, and the bill folded neatly beside her plate, its weight heavier than paper should ever be. That was when the question came, not loud, not meant for anyone else, just a small voice carrying more truth than it knew how to hold. Lily looked up at her mother with eyes too serious for 8 years and asked, "Mommy, if we eat all of this tonight, will we be hungry tomorrow?" The words weren't dramatic. There was no accusation in them, just logic. just fear shaped into a sentence. Rachel felt her throat close instantly, tears blurring her vision before she could stop them, her mind racing for an answer that wouldn't be a lie. Because the question wasn't really about food. It was about whether the world was safe, about whether the person they trusted most could protect them from what came next. She didn't answer right away because she couldn't, and in that pause, the diner went silent in a way that felt heavier than shouting. Behind her, laughter stopped cold. A fort froze inches above a plate. One of the bikers sat perfectly still, his jaw tightening as the question reached him like a memory he hadn't invited, dragging him back to nights when cupboards were empty and promises were thin, to a childhood where tomorrow was always a worry whispered in the dark. Rachel wiped her face quickly, embarrassed by the tears, by the truth showing through, and tried to smile, breaking a piece of food in half and sliding it toward the girls as if that simple motion could fix what the question had exposed. She didn't see the man behind her yet, the one whose heart had just cracked open in silence. But she felt something change in the room, something subtle and inevitable, like the moment before a decision that can never be taken back. The man who heard the question didn't move at first, not because it hadn't reached him, but because it had reached him too clearly, settling somewhere deep in his chest where old memories still lived uninvited. And for a long moment, he just sat there with his fork suspended in midair, staring past the steam rising from his untouched plate and into a past he had spent decades trying to outpace. His name was Marcus Dalton, though most people on the road knew him as Grave, a nickname earned long ago and worn like the heavy leather vest on his back, patched and weathered and marked with the insignia of the Hells Angels, a symbol that made strangers step aside and conversations grow careful. He had built a life on being the kind of man no one questioned, the kind who spoke once and was heard, the kind who didn't flinch. But that small voice from the booth in front of him had slipped past all of that, past reputation and pride and the armor he carried without thinking. "Mommy, if we eat all of this tonight, will we be hungry tomorrow?" The words echoed in his head, not as sound but as feeling, because he had asked that same question once, though he hadn't remembered it in years. He had grown up in a single wide trailer on the edge of a California town most maps forgot, where winter meant stuffing towels under the door to keep out the wind, and dinner meant whatever could be stretched to feed a growing boy, and a mother who pretended she wasn't hungry. He remembered watching her push her plate toward him with a tired smile, saying she had eaten earlier, saying she wasn't that hungry anyway, saying tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow had rarely been better. And now here he was, decades later, sitting in a warm diner with money in his wallet and brothers at his table, listening to a child ask a question no child should ever need to ask. Around him, the other bikers shifted, some confused by the sudden tension, others pretending not to notice, because men like them weren't known for stepping into quiet tragedies. They were known for roaring engines and long highways and a presence that warned more than it comforted. But Marcus couldn't look away from the booth. He saw the mother's shoulders trembling slightly, the way she wiped her face too quickly, the way she tried to smile as she broke the food into smaller pieces, stretching what little they had like it might multiply under pressure. He saw the girls eating carefully, not because they were full, but because they were thinking about tomorrow. That careful eating did something to him. It pulled at something buried. He set his fork down slowly. The sound was soft, but in the hush of the diner it carried. One of the younger bikers glanced at him, raising an eyebrow as if to ask what was wrong. Marcus didn't answer. He pushed his plate aside and rested both hands flat on the table, grounding himself in the present while the past tried to take over. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't a turf dispute. There was no enemy to confront, no challenge to answer with force. This was quieter than that, harder than that. He stood. The scrape of his chair against the tile floor cut clean through the room. The waitress froze mid-step. A man at the counter turned on his stool. The mother stiffened instantly, pulling her daughters closer without even realizing she was doing it, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. Marcus felt the fear ripple outward from her table, and for a brief second, he considered sitting back down, letting the moment pass, telling himself it wasn't his business. That would have been easier. Easier to be what people expected. Easier to keep walking. But he had made a promise once, long ago, standing outside that trailer with his fists clenched against the cold, that if he ever had enough money, enough power, enough control over anything at all, He would never ignore a hungry kid again. Somewhere along the miles of road and years of hardened choices, he had forgotten that promise. Until now. He stepped forward, heavy boots, echoing with each measured stride, not rushing, not looming, just moving with intention. He stopped beside their table, close enough to see the tear tracks on the mother's cheeks, close enough to see the girl's wide eyes staring up at him, not with the fear adults carried, but with curiosity. Children didn't always see patches and reputations the way grown-ups did. One of the twins met his gaze and held it, her expression serious but unafraid, and something inside him cracked a little wider. The mother turned slowly, her face pale, her voice caught somewhere between apology and defense, as if she expected him to complain about noise or space or something she had done wrong. He lifted a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to steady the moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its usual edge. "Let them eat," he said gently, nodding toward the plate. "All of it. Tonight's not about tomorrow." The words weren't poetic. They weren't rehearsed. But they were steady. The mother blinked, confusion flickering across her face, uncertainty battling pride. He could see the refusal forming before she even spoke it, the instinct to say she couldn't accept help, that they were fine, that she had it handled. He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, aware of every eye in the diner tracking the movement. From inside, he pulled out his worn leather wallet and placed it on the edge of the table. The sound it made against the wood was soft but final. "Dessert too," he said, glancing at the waitress who still stood frozen near the counter. "And something they can take with them for the morning." The waitress nodded quickly, her composure slipping as she hurried toward the kitchen. The mother shook her head, tears gathering again, whispering that she couldn't possibly let him do that. Marcus met her eyes, not stern, not commanding, just certain. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the strongest thing you can do is let somebody help." Around the diner, the tension shifted. One of the bikers at Marcus's table stood and walked to the register without a word. Then another followed. Bills were added to the tab quietly, without show, without announcement. No one pulled out a phone. No one clapped. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a decision. Marcus pulled a small folded card from his vest pocket and slid it across the table. It had an address written on it in rough handwriting. A warehouse downtown his chapter funded every winter, stocked with groceries and connections, and people who knew how to help without asking too many questions. "Go there in the morning," he told her. "Tell him Graves sent you." The mother stared at the card as if it might disappear. Then the tears came fully, her shoulders shaking as years of fear and exhaustion poured out in silent sobs she had never allowed herself before. The twins wrapped their arms around her, whispering reassurances in small voices. And Marcus stood there awkwardly for a second, unsure what to do with grief that raw. So he simply stayed, steady and present, until the weight in the room began to lift. The food arrived quietly, one plate at a time, as if the kitchen understood this wasn't just another order but a turning point. And soon the small booth that had felt so fragile was crowded with warmth and abundance. Pancakes replaced by pie, hot chocolate crowned with too much whipped cream, the kind of excess that felt almost unreal after so much careful counting. Lily laughed first, a small, surprised sound, like she hadn't meant to but couldn't stop it, and Nora followed, chocolate smearing across her lip as she forgot, for once, to eat slowly. Rachel watched them with her hands pressed to her mouth, committing the sight to memory because she knew this was the kind of moment that carried a person through darker days, the kind you replay when hope feels thin. The diner itself seemed to breathe again. Conversations resumed in low tones. Someone at the counter wiped at their eyes and stared into their coffee, suddenly embarrassed by the things they had complained about earlier that day. The waitress moved faster now, lighter somehow, setting plates down with care and refilling mugs she hadn't planned to refill. Marcus stepped back from the table and returned to his seat, the leather of his vest creaking as he sat, the patch of the Hells Angels catching the glow of the flickering Christmas lights for just a moment. He didn't touch his food. He just watched. Around him, his brothers paid their tabs one by one, adding a little extra without comment, without needing to be told. They understood. This wasn't about money. It was about something older than that. Outside, snow continued to fall, thick and steady, covering the highway in a quiet that felt almost gentle now. Rachel eventually stood, pulling her coat tighter around her daughters. her hands still trembling, but no longer from fear. She turned toward Marcus, their eyes meeting across the room. There was no speech prepared, no way to say thank you that didn't feel too small, so she simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement carrying more weight than words. Marcus nodded back, just once, and in that brief exchange was understanding. No debt owed, no story to tell, just a moment shared and released. The girls waved shyly as they passed him, their voices bright as they talked about dessert and Christmas morning, about simple things that felt possible again. When the door closed behind them, the diner's usual sounds slowly returned, forks clinking, chairs shifting, the jukebox humming softly in the corner. One of the younger bikers leaned over and muttered that he hadn't known Marcus had that in him. Marcus didn't answer right away. He watched the window until the girl's footprints disappeared under fresh snow, then exhaled deeply, as if something tight in his chest had finally loosened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me neither." He leaned back, letting the warmth of the room settle over him, knowing he hadn't fixed the world and hadn't erased tomorrow's worries, but he had answered a question when it mattered, and sometimes that was enough. Because kindness doesn't always arrive with fanfare, and hope doesn't always wear a friendly face. Sometimes it comes on heavy boots in a quiet diner, and sometimes it leaves behind nothing more than full plates, lighter hearts, and the knowledge that even the hardest shells can break open to reveal something human underneath.